Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Max Verstappen is the clear favourite for the upcoming Formula 1 season, but he's had his say on which team and driver pairing are the most likely to actually challenge Red Bull in the upcoming season. Not necessarily the team you might expect going into the season, especially when that team in question has had quite a few words to say over the last few days on the way Red Bull are currently conducting their business. Very much intrigued to your thoughts in the comments below. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I'd greatly appreciate it. On the verge of 34,000 subscribers, I'm pretty sure. Absolutely love to see it. Now, first of all, we've got to dive into the conclusion to race fans' driver rankings. We saw yesterday Hamilton was 5th, Leclerc was 4th, controversially so. Today, Norris gets 3rd, and as I pretty much expected, Alonso gets 2nd, and we know number 1 we'll see in a second. Now look, I think you can probably argue Norris 3rd. I think it's probably too high. Sure, the end of the season was very good, but made a fair few mistakes in qualifying, I would say. Very consistent in the races though, destroyed Piastri in that sense, and was, very competitive. But Leclerc kind of maybe outshone him over the last couple of races. Norris had a good chance to win in Singapore. That never came through. I will say you can definitely argue Norris 3rd in the Formula 1 rankings. What I think is far more difficult to argue possibly is that Norris was the 3rd best driver globally last year. This is Autosport's top 50 drivers of the season in any and all motorsports. Verstappen number 1, Alex Palou number 2, the IndyCar champion. Then Norris gets 3rd here, somehow. I don't really know how, but Alonso was 5th, Hamilton was 6th, and even Jake Dennis, for example, like Red Bull, well, basically Red Bull guy, but also Formula E champion, 9th place, Alex Albon was 10th. So, yeah, not really sure how this is justified, but, whatever, you guys can make your mind up on that. But yeah, Alonso 2nd, at least in the race fans list. What a phenomenal season. I think he probably would, he could have been 5th maybe, if not for Brazil, but at the end of the season, he put together another masterpiece in Brazil, got the podium. Aston Martin again, managed to put together a good weekend after a few difficult ones, and yeah, like 8 podiums for Alonso, something like that. It's just so incredible given the status of his career. What a driver, honestly. But of course, the driver of the season was Max Verstappen. No doubt about that, with all the championships won. Arguably the most impressive motorsport achievement of the year was Verstappen breaking Vettel's win streak, because that was something that I didn't think was going to go for some time, but Verstappen proved us wrong on that one. And of course, that wouldn't have been possible without the RB19. However, Max Verstappen's going to be the favourite for the new season, as are Red Bull. It's going to be difficult to beat them, but which team stands the best chance of doing so? Now, we'll discuss the teams in contention in a second. McLaren, though, and especially CEO Zak Brown, they've had quite some words to say on the way Red Bull are operating at the moment. This is, what is this, like 700 people or something at their factory? It might be more than that, to be honest. Massive teams these guys have, of course, to make these operations work. But Zak Brown came out with an open letter. This guy, he loves an open letter, right? Any opportunity he gets to write an open letter, he's going to take advantage of it. So here he goes, from Zak to you. If you want to read the whole thing, fair enough. It's a good letter, right? But it goes on quite a bit. So he talks about quite a lot, of course, gives respect to everyone involved in the project they had managed to achieve this year in all sorts of different motorsports, of course. He also gives a lot of credit to Verstappen and to Alonso for their achievements throughout the season, and to other drivers as well. But I thought it was quite nice to see, him give credit to Verstappen's achievements, and to Alonso, age is no barrier to success. 6 podiums in the first 8 races is, remarkable achievement. Then he goes on, of course, to talk about his own drivers, the success especially that maybe Oscar had. For example, having a good chance to get a podium in Silverstone, didn't happen because of the safety car. Hamilton gets it instead, then wins the Qatar sprint. Great podium in Suzuka, for example. So, basically he's just saying very bright future ahead for both of their driver pairings. Where things get kind of interesting though, I'd say, is when we get down to the bottom part here, where he starts to discuss the rest of the people in the sport, as he goes on to say here. And this is, quite the statement really to make publicly, I would say. That said, there is an opportunity to improve in some of the other processes in Formula 1 to strengthen the values of fairness and competition. The sport is not perfect, and as we look ahead to negotiating the next Concord Agreement to unite the governing body with the teams and commercial rights holders, we should prioritise some of those rules that currently impact the impartiality between competitors. Now, of course, you know where he's going with this, but yeah, the Concord Agreement, they've got to sign a new one. It's kind of partially in terms of that. The rumor is they're going to have to come up with a new number in terms of what have you got to pay to get into the sport. What's the number that potentially Andretti might have to put on the line to say, all right, we're going to pay this in addition to all of the other fees involved in getting into Formula 1 in order to compensate the teams for lost percentage of revenue. Whether that's ever going to be necessary, because the teams and the sport might just say no, which they're trying to, but it might prove to be challenging. challenging for various legal reasons. We haven't really had an update on the success of that Andretti entry for quite some time, although there are arguably other teams on the grid less deserving of a spot than they are, but that's not necessarily how reality works and how this sport works. You know, those teams could arguably be Haas, but certainly also AlphaTauri. And there's no denying that there's been, a lot of positive consequences to Red Bull coming in, buying Toro Rosso, taking them from, Minardi, which are just perennial backmarkers, to being somewhat competitive. And, they've had some benefits from that. A lot of drivers on the current grid have gone through that Red Bull Junior program, right? But it does create issues, and as Zak Brown goes on to say, for example, most other major sports prohibit the ownership of two teams within the same league because of the obvious potential damage that it does to competition. It is an unhealthy situation because it impacts decisions made both on and off the track, whether it's a case of having access to more data, sharing components or personnel, or even having influence over a strategic vote. It is not in the spirit of the regulations. It is important to stand up for independence, competition and fairness, and I'd like to see changes in the regulations to ensure that in the future and stop influence spreading from one team to another through strategic alliances and especially through ownership. Formula 1 should be true to its brand, and every team except power units should be totally independent of one another. So of course, he has to clarify this given the fact that he is a Mercedes customer. They, buy the engines of Mercedes, but they do basically everything else themselves. And, they're not tied to Mercedes in the same way that AlphaTauri, Racing Bulls potentially, are tied to Red Bull. McLaren, if they have a decision to make, which potentially differs to Mercedes, they are free to do that, whereas AlphaTauri aren't necessarily, and in terms of voting or whatever, Red Bull can effectively wield their power over two teams. Now, sure, in the history of Formula 1, lots of engine suppliers have effectively, the engine customer has been under the thumb of the engine supplier, has often been how it's gone. And you often see alignment from those two parties, but it's never quite as closely aligned, maybe, as Red Bull and AlphaTauri are. So I can't really explain Zak Brown's points better than he has done so himself. I believe Formula 1 fans universally believe in fairness in competition and a level playing field and would reject any actions that compromise the true spirit of competition within Formula 1. Part sharing of information, shared ownership models, and the strategic alliances within the sporting fabric of F1 will only serve to undermine the fans' belief in fair and fierce competition. So, and then he basically signs up and says, GG guys, we'll see you all next year. So, very interesting stuff from Zak Brown, quite the statement really. Obviously Fred Vasseur commented on this as well and said that it's a strange situation. The FIA has been able to manage it so far, however well they've managed it, that's another debate, and I'm sure they'll be able to in the future. Which is, well, other teams are slightly less sure they'll be able to manage it well into the future. He also mentioned in this article, though, that he believes they have the strongest pairing on the grid. I think he would say that. I think Toto Wolff would say the same thing. I think Christian Horner would say the same thing, although that might be difficult to justify. And Fred Vasseur would probably say the same thing as well. I think he has a case, I guess, here. Norris has been great. Piastri has proved his worth massively. I think there's still a way for Piastri to go in terms of, race pace and tyre management, stuff like this. Norris still kind of cooked him in those conditions. I think where Piastri was really strong were in either sprint races or in Qatar, let's say, when there wasn't really much tyre management to be done because they were forced to make changes to the tyres every so often. So next year, Christian Horner and Red Bull, of course, are looking at where their competition is going to come from. They've talked about the next year's car as well. There's been different kind of opinions and rumours on this as well, because Horner says the car next year is going to be an evolution, not a revolution. And of course, to some degree, it's always going to be an evolution, right? They're not going to completely throw away everything about this RB19. They're going to keep lots of, I'm sure, good ideas about it. There were rumours, though, that in terms of the floor concept and even in the suspension, Adrian Newey and his team are cooking up other ideas. I'm sure that the base philosophy and ideas have to stay relatively the same because, there's only so much you can do theoretically, but there's some people that say that parts of the car are being even in some sense revolutionized, but Horner says that really it's more of an evolution, which is probably what you might expect. But of course they're going to be in a good position regardless. Even Max Verstappen was discussing this and says that he's seen some drawings, it looks interesting, but I'm sure the guys have already done some simulator work with the RB20 theoretically as well. So that is the Red Bull, and that is the team and the driver pairing to beat, no doubt about it. Who can get close? There's 4 real candidates. I'm not expecting anybody else to be able to get close outside of Aston Martin potentially, who were incredibly impressive at the start of last season in the hands of Fernando Alonso, but even Mike Cracker said they're not expecting the progress they gained last season. They're not expecting to take that big step. And also it was probably because of Mercedes and Ferrari and certainly McLaren dropping the ball at the start of last season that opened the door to Aston Martin more than it was that, they did a stunning job. They certainly did. But if Mercedes and Ferrari took the step expected from them based on their performance in 22, Aston Martin wouldn't have been getting all these podiums they eventually achieved. Ferrari as well, I mean, look, they were the only team to win a race this season. They're always going to be, usually at least, there or thereabouts. Certainly at tracks like Monza, or, this season, most tracks towards the end of the year suited them reasonably well. I mean, let's be honest, in the hands of Leclerc, they were overtaking McLaren at the end of the year again. Like, Leclerc was the one in contention, overtaking Verstappen in Las Vegas. Abu Dhabi, of course, Leclerc was the closest challenge to the Red Bulls. So I think there's definitely, in the hands of the McLaren, we'll discuss in a second, plenty for them to learn and figure out, because when it was a track that suited the McLaren, they were the fastest car. But even tracks that, even Brazil, Leclerc put it P2 in qualifying, a track that on paper didn't really suit the Ferrari that well. So they made more steps, I think, this season than should be, it's sometimes overlooked, I think, but mainly that was in the hands of Leclerc towards the end of the season. Sainz couldn't really get it together. And as a result of the Ferrari progress, Mercedes dropped back towards the end of the year. And of course, as Brundle says, they're not the force they once were. Now, looking at the championship history for the last decade and a half, you would probably say, and I would probably say, if there is any team that is likely, most likely than anybody, to actually win a championship, it's probably going to be Mercedes and Hamilton, just because they've got the experience as a team and as a driver pairing. They've proven they can do it before for many years in a row. So, I'd say they're the most likely to achieve that. However, are they the most likely to produce a great car that can actually challenge Verstappen and Red Bull? Not necessarily. I think there's a difference between the best chance of producing the best car and the best chance of winning a championship, because, I would trust Hamilton more so to deliver that if the car is there than I would Norris, because as many have said in the comment section below, in order to win a championship, first you've got to win a race. And that, of course, has proven a bit of a step for Norris over the last couple of years. But Verstappen, of course, good friends with Norris, does believe they are the team to beat. He's given his thoughts on it, and he said that based on the way last season ended, with the 9 podiums, Oscar Piastri winning the sprint race in Qatar, McLaren lots of momentum, especially given where they started the season. And to be fair, when Ferrari kind of overtook them at the end, and maybe they took a bit of a step back relatively, they weren't really bringing any more upgrades, right? They'd obviously brought their upgrades, they'd achieved a lot with them, and then they focus on next year's car. And McLaren have said, Norris has said, that he thinks next year for sure he's going to be winning a race. He said that the team have said they're moving in a good direction, they know what they need to change, they know how to take steps forwards. Their car concept was probably the closest after the upgrades to what Red Bull did. So, they made good steps, and if they can make that step again over the winter, they could be a serious challenger. But I think it's always difficult to imagine a team that isn't, Mercedes, their engine, Mercedes should be able to do a better job with their own engine and components than a customer team can do, if Mercedes don't mess it up, which they did last year for sure. Especially towards the end of the season, we saw how far off the pace Mercedes still were, really, compared to even some of their customer teams. So Verstappen says, we were the only consistent team, but behind us, it was a close battle. It will all depend on how much they improve, but the one that I think was most impressive from where they started to where they ended was McLaren. So it looks like they might be very strong next year. So, of all the potential rivals, the only one that he singles out as the very strong potential challenger, given the step McLaren took over the season, and therefore theoretically could continue onwards over the winter, is potentially McLaren. So that's the team, it seems, that Verstappen is most interested in. And you can see why. I mean, this, for example, is, the course of the season, the race put together here. Let's say that Verstappen and Perez didn't exist. This would have been the championship. So, of course, Alonso taking a nice, healthy early lead. Norris dropping back into the stratosphere, really, and barely getting any points on the board. And, Alonso had a quite significant lead at this stage. The Ferraris, of course, of Leclerc eventually comes through. And it was round about Belgium, Netherlands, and then, going into Italy and beyond, really, where Norris started to actually pick up some serious points. Japan, Silverstone, Qatar, and all this. And Norris just comes storming through as Alonso drops back. And at the end of the season, Hamilton just about holds on for the championship victory. Norris was actually in the end just behind Leclerc, with him making big progress. But, look at this line, dropping back to Canada and then Austria. And then after that, Norris was closing in on the theoretical championship lead without Verstappen basically every single week. Max also says, the other teams aren't stupid. They are learning as well. The other teams are going to catch them up. But, maybe McLaren do produce the best car, but it is a different story between producing the best car and delivering a championship result. We've seen a few times Verstappen go wheel to wheel with Norris, and Norris hasn't really fought him. I mean, especially, I know many of you guys remember the US Grand Prix when, did Norris defend from Max into turn 9 or whatever it is, right? At the end of that long back straight. Not really. It might be turn 10 or turn 12 or something, actually, but you guys know what I mean. So, there was always that moment, and I think people are going to have concerns about McLaren really challenging for a championship because it's probably not going to be Piastri, right? Norris has better race pace. I'd expect it to take Piastri a couple of years really to try and get to the level of consistent race pace that Norris can manage at the moment, who has more Formula 1 experience. But, so I don't think Piastri is going to be the one if they have a competitive car challenging for a title next season. But if it's going to be Norris, then I think there's a lot to learn for Norris. There's lots of races to be won for Norris if he actually wants to compete for a championship, and he hasn't got one race victory on the board yet. So that's always going to be a bit of a hurdle for them. But on paper, Verstappen's not necessarily wrong. I just think that if there is going to be a more likely candidate to fight for the championship, it's probably going to be Hamilton or maybe Leclerc, depending on how Ferrari do next season. But time will only tell. The car, of course, as we know in Formula 1, is the biggest factor. Speaking of that, I suppose, Haas, they had a hard time with Hülkenberg. Rumour has it that Hülkenberg has been very widely linked to a 2025 move to Sauber. We've talked for quite some time, really, that Sauber, when they become Audi Sauber, want some German representation. We know that Sainz has been linked there as well because of their, partnerships with his dad and all this type of stuff. But we've heard rumours that Sauber, when they're Audi, they certainly want a German driver. We've heard talks about even trying to get Vettel out of retirement. We've heard talks about maybe getting Mick Schumacher in. But Hülkenberg would also be a very valid option as well. So that's definitely a quite likely one to keep your eyes on going forward, I would say. And just before we close out, thought this is an interesting question for you guys. Best race of 2023. Few candidates really here. Las Vegas was pretty good. I think really most people will choose either Zandvoort or Singapore. Zandvoort was absolute chaos at the start of that race with the rain and everything, all the overtakes that happened, Mercedes messing up the strategy, Red Bull still coming out of it 1-2, I'm pretty sure. It was an absolute mad race. Singapore, though, I think was the best race just because, well, it was a bit of a slow burner during the Grand Prix. The last 15 laps were the most thrilling laps, I think, of the season. Red Bull were out of the picture, and sure, you might say, oh, it's unfair to Red Bull to choose a race that they didn't win, given they won 21 races, to choose the other one. But I think that did the fact that Red Bull were out of it, they didn't get the setup right, meant that you had 4 cars within 2 seconds on track, all fighting for the victory. Russell was coming through, Mercedes got the split strategy, there were questions, they were closing every single lap, but the question was, how much life were they taking out of the tyres? Once they got there, would they be able to get the move done? Eventually, Sainz, of course, with the great defending, keeping Norris in the DRS, allowed him to defend himself. Maybe Hamilton would have got through because Russell had cooked his tyres towards the end, and then Russell binned it in the wall. So it was a massively entertaining final 15 laps. So I would say that was my race of the season. But very much interested to your thoughts in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed. Subscribe if you're new. Take care. And I'll see you next time.